In 2012, I thought it would be a good idea to assemble a bunch of volunteers to try to solve one problem, and then try to solve a different problem every year. We utterly failed. We've only looked at one problem, we haven't solved it, and we're still trying to solve it 8 years later. But other than that, it's been a smashing success. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, a podcast about technology, history, and getting myself out of debt. Thanks to Daniel Boyd, Peter Healy, and the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. And thanks to Dan Tobias for the idea for this episode. In 2012, after 3 years of archive team and all of the success that we'd had, I wanted to take the lessons learned there and turn it around into other ways to help people. My basic idea, which was either naive or incredibly optimistic, was that a lot of problems that we think of as unsolvable simply lack the labor and focus and don't have an easy way to funding and administrative costs to make it happen. So I thought, if we were able to make archive team happen, why couldn't we just take 1 month every year to solve the problem? All we'd have to do, my thinking said, was describe the problem properly, give people a way to help, and then sit back, keep everyone as focused as you could, and 30 days in, you'd have the basic foundation for a project that could keep itself going. Now, this fails on multiple levels. First of all, unfunded mandates sound great when you describe them as long as you don't mention that people aren't getting paid. As a result, there are actually very, very few problems out there that aren't in some way you taking away potential work and proper professional efforts. So thinking of it that way, there are actually very few unsolved projects that aren't in some way already extant and requiring more attention and focus. In other words, recreating from scratch something that already exists causes trouble in 2 ways. First of all, you're taking away from efforts and lessons learned by others and portraying it that your ground-up invention is better, and pulling resources away from those people because you've said that what you're working on is better and in more need of labor, volunteer or not. I should have said spoiler alert, but you get what I'm saying here. If I start on a project and I don't make an effort to find out who else is already working on it, then I'm just causing trouble with no benefit other than creating a half-baked initial set of outlines. But, unaware of that lesson to be learned, we set off on what we thought would be the first of many different problems and projects. In my time speaking with other people in digital preservation and archives, there was a very strong feeling among a lot of people that we lacked a universal file format registry. There were other projects that had file formats enumerated with examples and programs, but they almost always did it in service of one institution's needs, and the resulting information was almost always in some way locked down. So while you might find a registry here or a list of information there, it almost always required you to only want formats that institution or group dealt with. If they were a video editing group, they kept track of video file formats. If it was an audio group, then it was for things only involving sound, and so on. There wasn't anyone, as far as I could tell, being completely agnostic on file formats. So we made that the first just solve the problem. File formats. The original plan was to create a wiki called Just Solve It that would every year be set up anew with something that a wiki could solve, a dumping of information, a sharing of resources, and then it would mature into another wiki located elsewhere, and then the cycle would continue. Every year, people would assemble, talk to each other, start to build up a framework, and then that finished framework would end up somewhere else and blossom into a project. So let's get that mistake set aside. It's not hard to start a new project. It is, in fact, incredibly easy. If you take a wiki and there's no rules, no framework, no agreements in place, no legacy weight to have to deal with, it is incredibly simple to make a bunch of articles, interlink them, and call it a day. It is the most effortless thing to walk into a field completely free of encumbrances, start to construct your little shack of ideas, and then build things around it. The actual hardest thing is to walk into a forest of pre-made allegiances and organizational weight and try to heft it into something easier to use. So we weren't doing that. We were going to list every file format that we could find. So organizing this project, I made several choices, which I'm happy about, and they're probably worth going into. One of them is that I'm quite happy to use a wiki, even though I made my way as a Wikipedia critic in the 2000s, because it wasn't the MediaWiki software or any wiki software that I had problems with. It was organizational rules, chain of command, and policy about entry. So when we set up the file format wiki, I set myself up as the place where the buck stopped. If two people were arguing over some minor point, I could step in an editor-in-chief role and put a stop to it. In my opinion, that kills a lot of the problems that wikis have, where it's an endless churn of people fighting over minor things that eventually envelops the entire project, and if it doesn't kill it, it doesn't make it stronger either. Another choice was to expand the idea of a file format. And what this means is that I didn't want to stop at file formats like JPEG or PNG or WAV. I wanted to involve every file format. And to do so, we defined it as anywhere information was kept in a way that others would have to take some effort to read it. In this way, I added entries for piano rolls, DNA, tree rings, and doing so brought out the most interesting situation. We announced the file format wiki and started taking people in, and like any project that starts out, some people jump right in and just want to work, while others turn around and start arguing over the choices you're making. And I was surprised, honestly surprised, at how many professional archivists and digital file folks were infuriated at the inclusion of tree rings and piano rolls. They thought that it was a blasphemy to extend things out here, that putting in things like written and spoken languages, programming languages, and different formats of different fonts was going to bog the project down. And so they almost immediately dropped their tools, walked away, and called the project utterly doomed. This meant that the only people who stuck around were the ones who didn't care about arguing that and just wanted to put things together. So within those 30 days, we probably had about 8 or 12 people working on this day and night, coming up with all sorts of links to all sorts of file format discussions, running down through different media formats and trying to find any documentation whatsoever, and then just refining, reformatting, and improving any article they could. Wikis are funny. They're a cacophony of ideas smashing into each other with all sorts of programming ways to prevent editing conflict, but nothing about policy and politics in putting those words together. It's incumbent upon whoever's organizing it and using it to keep those rules of society in shape. MediaWiki only cares that every piece of text that people are putting in is accounted for, even with the race condition of multiple windows open. It doesn't really care in any way how there's a hierarchy or assembly or whether or not anything makes sense. That's not its job. It doesn't do it very well. What it is nearly bulletproof software running on a server and allowing hundreds or thousands to edit it at the same time. So what happened is that the file format wiki got up to a few hundred articles within 30 days. And those 8 people, who had slowly shrunk to a half dozen, kept going. They kept adding articles, references, interlinking. They built a hierarchy of files that would be used by Atari computers, but also be used by printing programs, or building indexes based on names of formats, their ISO standard numbers, and different tables of information based on those articles. Because you see, the file format wiki is primarily a pointer to other documents. Many documents are out there waiting to be discovered or in need of somebody referencing them, or they become incredibly hard to find. Adding that little bit of information to show the context of the file format documents makes all the difference in the world. 2012 turned into 2013, and as the time came up for the next problem to solve, it occurred to me solving this problem was going to take a lot longer. It was worth it, in fact, to keep the machine running just as it was. Instead of just solve, it became fileformats.archiveteam.org. It continued to grow. 2013 turned into 2014, 15, 16. And the file formats wiki was still getting new entries every day, every week. It was growing into thousands of pages about file formats. Every once in a while, I'd go and look at it, and it would have grown in some spectacular fashion, tackling something completely new in music or programming, or even long-forgotten formats that nobody was using anymore. Most amusing for me was that every time something made the news and involved something being deciphered or figured out or unencrypted, it was inevitable that one of those engaged, powerful file format wiki editors would add an entry into the wiki. It was like watching a miraculous mirror that held up every time a file format became part of the conversation. If somebody unencrypted an arcade machine, it would show up in the file format wiki. If someone discussed an obscure format in the tech news, it showed up on the wiki. And throughout this, my relationship to it is relatively distant. These folks are working together. The amount of times that they need an editor-in-chief to set his foot down and finish things is basically zero. They've got it together. They know what they are, what this is, and where it's going. So on one level, this project has been an abject failure. It's been 8 years. We haven't just solved 8 different problems, but we have gone an incredible distance in solving, or at least controlling, one of the more pressing issues in the digital world: how we're going to decode all of these files going forward. And I think of all the failures I've experienced, this is probably going to end up being my proudest of all. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, thanks to Emilio Oliveira, James Bekoyanu, Mark Pilgrim, Scott McGrady, Scott Roseanne, and Wayne Arthurton, along with the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. The File Formats Wiki is still running. It's at fileformats.archiveteam.org. It's an incredible resource. People use it all the time to figure out what are they looking at, what a format means, what the names are, who created it, and what tools exist for dealing with it. And as I hope I've made clear, and as I can as gently put it to you as possible, I've learned an important lesson about wandering into a field that I think has been lying dormant, waiting for me, and acting like I have been a great explorer, the one who will save everybody, and the most intelligent top hat in the room. While there have been exceptions to the idea of waiting to learn a little more why things are what they are that, exceptions. And it's best to find out if your incredible discovery isn't already someone's home.